I am going to be presenting my research story on murdered and missing Indigenous women in New Mexico. For my personal story, I found out about the topic of MMIW through a crime podcast talking about a case in Montana with boarding towns. They had described how a Native woman was murdered by two white men, and the men faced little punishment due to local police officers being buddy-buddy with the man. I had looked into this because I've heard of things like this happening before with border towns where Native women are not receiving any justice, and from research I found that this is a very common thing that happens. And I have known about the topic for a few years, but I have never dived more into it, and this podcast allowed me to learn more about the topic. And I then went to All My Relations podcast, where they are an Indigenous podcast that talks about contemporary issues in Indian country, and they have an episode on MMIW. Listening to these podcasts brought so many emotions, from anger to sadness to grief and a need for justice. I chose this as my topic for this project because I wanted to learn more about the topic myself, but I also wanted other people to learn about it. I chose to make my topic more specific by focusing on MMIW in New Mexico due to the high rates of cases. It was alarming to read that 2 of the top 5 hotspots in the US were in New Mexico. I began to focus on the why, and I couldn't stop thinking about why this keeps happening and how can we even solve a problem as big as MMIW. It can seem overwhelming, but there are specific parts of the conversation that each need to be talked about, from awareness to law enforcement to land jurisdiction, from social media to media in general, from racism and to stereotypes and etc. And by organizing the topic into categories where I think there needs to be worked in, allowed me to pick the topics of land jurisdiction, racism, law enforcement, and public safety. And these are topics that I felt are not discussed enough and I wanted to learn more about. My literature review was split into 3 categories of public safety, land jurisdiction, and law enforcement in New Mexico. When I was doing research and writing my literature review, I had found a lot of new information about my topic, and I will touch on some of the highlights from it. I learned how this violence against Native women is not a new conversation. It has been happening since colonialism and since Columbus. There's evidence where Columbus would sell Native women, girls, and boys to Europe in a way of starting sex trafficking. And it's just been something that has been happening for a very long time. I was learning more about what tribal law enforcement was like in New Mexico, and I learned that they are under-policed by 57%. And this is an alarming statistic that shows that we need more officers within tribal government and that we need more work to be done so that we can stop so many of these high-risk cases for Native women because they are at a higher risk of violence. And it just shows with the statistic why that is. I had examined what the state of New Mexico has to say about public safety in general and found that they quote, "Our priority is to protect human life and property through the detection and prevention of criminal activity and enforcement of state laws and regulations." This quote actually made me very surprised because it is not true. Even the state of New Mexico Indian Affairs Department denies this quote. They explain the opposite of how public safety is not being met and that the trust responsibility is failing. I then looked into more about land jurisdiction and specifically with New Mexico, and this topic allowed me to learn more about the types of jurisdiction, and it just confirmed the messiness and the history of it is just very messy, and there is still that checkerboard of land jurisdiction where within this there are gaps within it where criminal jurisdiction changes, and there are even gaps where nobody really knows who has jurisdiction, and this just calls for more delaying and impacting Native women cases, and it also causes for people to get away with these violent crimes to Native women. And I learned more about the different acts that have impacted MMIW, from the General Crimes Act and Major Crimes Act, that allow for the federal government to have jurisdiction over tribal government within tribal boundaries, and the federal government has power within these cases of murder, assault with intent, and rape, and it puts tribal law at a loss to protect Native women because they are not the ones in charge of these cases. I learned more about border towns in New Mexico, and specifically the border town of Farmington, New Mexico. This town has had a long and violent history with indigenous people, and the town has a lot of discrimination and racism towards Native people. This town is known to participate in something called Indian rolling, which is this disgusting way where young white guys go cruising around late at night to search for a Native person to kill. They would often take them to isolated areas, often canyons. Specifically for this town, it is a canyon called Chokecherry Canyon. And this is where the young white men or guys would abuse and murder Native people. There have been many gruesome murders in this town and a lot of violence that has been happening for decades. Even in 2006, there was a case of a Navajo man getting a ride from three young men, white men, out of a town, and they took him to Chokecherry Canyon, where they beat him and yelled racial slurs at him. The Navajo man survived and reported the crime, but the three white men only faced 6 years in jail each. And then I found out that even with this report, this was actually the first time the district attorney in this area has ever filed a hate crime for Native people. All of these decades, and this is the first time we have ever had them reported, which I think is very problematic and very alarming, because it just proves that these border towns are not doing their job at protecting Native women. And with this case, a week after it, another Navajo man was murdered. He was shot in broad daylight near police officers in the town. And there is just so much violence, and it's not only in this border town, but in many other border towns throughout New Mexico. And my challenges for my literature review, I had some challenges finding sources relating to New Mexico specifically, and I had a hard time finding sources on border towns relating to MMIW, and it seemed that many of these sources did not want to make law enforcement look bad. Out of all my findings in my literature review, a quote really stood out to me. It was from Melinda Limberhand, who is a mother of Hannah Harris, and Hannah Harris was killed on the Cheyenne Reservation. She said, "Bad people commit these horrible crimes against Native women, but it is the system that allows it to happen generation after generation." And this quote just connects everything, because it shows that if we continue the way we have been with protecting Native women, then we are not going to make a change. We have to do more, otherwise the system will continue to negatively impact Native women. The three topics of land jurisdiction, public safety, and law enforcement are all related because they all impact an Indigenous woman's everyday safety. If we have these issues of land jurisdiction, where a person calls in for help and an officer is delayed to the location due to not knowing who has jurisdiction, then safety and trust is gone. If there are issues of racism and stereotypes and violence in towns bordering reservations, where officers are known to look the other direction of crimes against Native people, then safety is again gone. Everything sources back to public safety for Indigenous women. It should be a right that you can be protected, and that we should be fighting for this more. But unfortunately, the things I've discussed with the lack of communication, racism, stereotypes, etc., it is just so difficult. It is an entire system that we would need an update on. For how this is connected to my action memo, it is all about safety and law enforcement. Through people having knowledge on MMIW issues, it can be a first step in tackling this issue. My action memo is going to target the state of New Mexico within their Department of Public Safety and Law Enforcement. Within this means that first the state should reconsider what they think public safety is and include Native women's safety into the conversation. There should be general information on those in New Mexico government on public safety, and those people should be held accountable for their actions with helping MMIW cases. There should be a target to the New Mexico government on public safety, because they have a large amount of MMIW cases and they are failing the trust responsibility of protecting these Native women. For the law enforcement side, there needs to be trainings on Indigenous people and their history And there also needs to be trainings on contemporary issues facing the Native communities in the area. This is especially needed for border town officers. There also needs to be a greater effort of communication for the officers in New Mexico, so that this can be an essential way of stopping the violence to Native women.